Our first step in this process is to use something to feed the yeasts. The comedian Tim Allen used to boast about having tools that could fix tools. Well, in your kitchen, you have food that can feed your food. We're going to be using some honey here, and this is teas honey. This is special Florida Gold Tupelo honey that was brought back from Florida by John and Connie Williams, but feel free to use any inferior honey of your own. If you are vegan and prefer not to use an animal or insect product, you can use molasses, which is made from sorghum. If you're going to do that, I would recommend using 1/4 of a cup or less. It's a little bit of that goes a long way. You can also use agave nectar, and you can use that interchangeably with the honey. You could also use some white or brown sugar. And again, for that, since a little bit goes a long way, I would use 1/4 of a cup or less. If you're using honey or agave nectar, go ahead and use up to 1/2 a cup. Next, you're going to want to add some hot water from the tap to your honey or other sweetened liquid. You'll want to add liquid until you get up to 1.5 cups total. Now you want it to be hot water. Hot water comes out of a tap in most residences at around 120 degrees, but once you get into a container and mix everything up to get everything dissolved, whether it be the honey or the agave nectar or the molasses or the sugar, it will have cooled off a few degrees. You'll need a temperature of around 105 to 110 degrees. You can use a thermometer if you really want to check this, but really after a minute or so with some agitation outside of the tap, it should be all right and ready to go ahead and add your active dry yeast. Just go ahead and add one of these little packets and wait and see what happens after giving it a little bit of a stir. Meanwhile, we can mix our dry ingredients together. This particular recipe calls for 3 cups of flour. You can use your ordinary all-purpose flour for this. And in fact, I've used 2 cups of all-purpose flour already in the bowl. And for the 3rd cup, I'm going to use what's called spelt flour. Spelt is an ancient grain. It's a kind of cousin of wheat. It has a very pleasant, nutty flavor. You can feel free to substitute any quantity of the all-purpose flour or none of it. You can use something like a whole wheat flour for some of it. You can use a rye flour, or you could use this spelt here, if you can find it. So we're going to go ahead and add that to the 2 cups of flour we already have, and 1 teaspoon of salt, right? You're the salt of the earth, but you can use the salt of the sea, or even the salt of the supermarket. Now, look what a beautiful head of foam that yeast mixture has on it. Looks like those yeasty boys are ready to fight for their right to party, so just go ahead and add it straight into the flour. Honestly, you can mix this up just fine by hand. It's a fairly liquidy dough, a fairly runny dough. If you've made bread before, don't worry about that. That's the way it's supposed to be. Or if you really like, you can use a dough robot. Once your dough is mixed, you can just leave it in the bowl in which you mixed it and go ahead and cover it. You can use a plastic wrap. You could probably get away with a dish towel. We're going to be using this bees wrap, which is just a cotton cloth coated with beeswax, and so it's a form of kind of reusable plastic wrap. At this point, you can let it rest for between 8 and 24 hours. And so if you do this on Saturday, you can wake up Sunday morning to bake some beautiful communion bread. So here we are about a day later, and we're going to take a look at our bread dough. It looks like you can see that it has sort of risen up the edges before relaxing a little bit. Nice good bubbles in there. And so I've generously floured a surface over here right next to it, and we're just going to end up pouring the dough out using a little dough scraper to get all out there, and we're going to let it rest for about 30 minutes. While your dough is resting, you'll also want to heat up the pan in the oven and also heat up the oven. So you're going to want to start your oven, and you're going to want to set it to 450 degrees. There's no need to preheat the oven. That would be too much. That would be heating the oven before you heat the oven. Really, you just have to heat the oven. And so once the oven has reached 450 degrees, you're all ready. In addition to heating the oven, we're going to be heating the container in which we'll be baking the bread. This is a small enameled cast iron cooker. You could also use an oven-safe bowl or even a loaf pan. It's been 30 minutes, and we're just going to put our dough onto a parchment paper. I would not use wax paper for this, and drop it right into our baking vessel and close the oven. We're going to then put the cover on and bake it for 30 minutes. And now we're going to uncover it to get a nice browning on top there, harden up the crust for another 15 minutes. When it's done, you can just take it out and leave it to cool for a bit. And boy, wouldn't you look at that, that just looks wonderful. Here's a pro tip. You can sort of score the top of it to make the breaking of the bread a little bit easier.